So welcome back then to the reading guide for Daniel as we begin to answer or attempt to answer the first question I gave you, which was to chart out sort of the chronology and the plot of Daniel. And I tried to indicate that it's a bit confusing. And so if you felt really confused, that would be normal. So let's try and look at it together and see how everything sort of fleshes out. It starts in chapter 1 in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he besieged it. And of course, that's when he took Daniel and his friends to Babylon. And then there's a reference at the end here of the chapter where it says Daniel was there, meaning in Babylon, until the 1st year of King Cyrus, the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, this is just a reference for how long Daniel's going to stay in Mesopotamia till he dies there, all the way to 70 years later under the Persians. Okay, then chapter 2 starts out in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. There's this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, and that's the story of chapter 2. And then chapter 3 starts out, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, and you can keep reading and you'll see that there's no reference to the chronology. The only thing we know is that clearly this is probably after Daniel is in school, because the first chapter he was sort of in training with his friends in what is essentially the University of Babylon, and then he ends up serving in the court, and this is later when he's already serving in the court. So this is after chapter 1. We can work that out chronologically, but we don't know exactly when it was. Notice we're just doing chronology right now. We'll come back and do the plot as a second thing. Then in chapter 4, we get what is essentially a letter of some kind, or decree, from Nebuchadnezzar to all peoples, nations, and languages. And this is Nebuchadnezzar's own writing. So all of chapter 4 is actually in the first person. This is the end of the chapter. I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of Heaven. So all of chapter 4 is Nebuchadnezzar writing about his experience when he had this warning in the form of a dream of a tree, and how he didn't heed the warning and he was chastised, disciplined for 7 years. And this is presumably later than what we saw in chapter 3, the building of the giant golden statue. This seems to be more toward the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, perhaps toward the very end. And then in chapter 5, it says King Belshazzar, and right away well, this is obviously not King Nebuchadnezzar, and if you looked it up, you would learn that Belshazzar was regent in the city of Babylon many years after King Nebuchadnezzar, so this is much later, and this is the story of his party, his feast that he makes, and how that very night, it says at the end of the chapter, the Chaldean king, Chaldean just means Babylonian king, was killed. And what happens, Darius the Mede, otherwise known more famously as Cyrus, Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. So this is now a transfer from the Babylonian rule of the Israelites in Babylon and out in Mesopotamia, and now the Medo-Persian Empire, the Medes and the Persians, take over Babylon and continue to rule the Israelites and the territory of Israel. And that's the end of chapter 5. And so we're not surprised in chapter 6 that we have a statement about Darius setting Daniel over the kingdom. We're not told exactly when this is, but it's obviously after chapter 5 when the Medo-Persians take over Babylon. And this is the famous story of Daniel in the lion's den. The problem now comes in chapter 7, where we read, in the 1st year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Well, wait, I thought we were under the Persians now. And now we're going back to the time of Belshazzar, who was regent of Babylon. And then look at chapter 8. It starts out with the 3rd year of King Belshazzar. Again, that's the king from chapter 5. He's a Babylonian regent in the city of Babylon. So we're out of chronological sequence. That's the point. And then it says, in the first year of Darius, and now we're back to Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, by descent a Mede. So now we're back into the Medo-Persian rule again under Darius during his first year. And then in chapter 10, it says, in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Again, there's some dispute about this, but I think the arguments are probably best that Darius and Cyrus are the same people, or Darius. Some people, of course, say Darius the king. I'll probably flip back and forth. Depends on where you live in the world and where you speak English, where you learn to speak English as to how to pronounce his name. All right, and that takes you pretty much through the book. There's a reference in chapter 11 that talks about, sorry, I skipped over that, that talks about the first year of Darius, but that's actually the high angel talking about a time frame which is a couple of years before what's the chronological setting of the visions in chapter 10 to 12, okay? And just so you know, the vision that starts in chapter 10, a high angel comes, or some very unique messenger comes to Daniel, and it says here, a hand touched me in verse 10 of chapter 10, and then a vision comes here in chapter 11, and then it just keeps going. So there's this, all of chapter 10, 11, and 12 are the visit of this high angel, this high messenger, and the vision that he provides Daniel. It's a very long and extended vision, but it's just one vision. All right, so what does that look like when we plot it out on a graph here? I mean, a chart. It looks like this. We've got what seems like a nice chronological sequence, all related to Babylon. Babylon taking over Judah and Jerusalem and bringing Daniel to the city of Babylon, and then all of these events that happen that relate to primarily to Nebuchadnezzar and his sort of journey, the various revelations that God gave to him, right up until you get to a new king of Babylon, a regent actually of Babylon, which is Belshazzar. And then after that, the next chronological progression to Darius, who is the Medo-Persian king. So all that seems very nice chronologically, and then suddenly you get to Belshazzar, which is now this dream, not dream, it's a vision of these four beasts. But it's during the reign of Belshazzar. So we're now going back to this guy, right, over here. And then the third year of Belshazzar, and again, we're back to here. So we're not following a chronological order, and then you get to the first year of Darius, which is probably the same guy as this guy here, and now the third year. So that's somewhat chronological back to this guy, those things related there. All right, so all that is just to say we're not seeing a nice chronological progression. It starts that way, and then it gets jumbled into a bunch of visions and dreams, and they get out of chronological sequence. All that is to say, the book is clearly not composed or structured on a purely chronological framework, nor is it just a simple plot, which was the next challenge. What's the plot sort of the book? And as you get into the plot, it's at least somewhat clearer that there are two halves to the book. Okay? So let's look at the two halves in terms of just following the plot. We start with the Babylonians taking over Jerusalem and Daniel being transferred to Babylon, so we get a new beginning. And the new beginning is Daniel is now a young student in the schooling of Babylon, and he and his friends are being trained in Babylon. It's a new beginning for them, a new life, literally, as they've been taken from their parents and so on and brought to Babylon, and they're living under the Babylonian authority, and as was common for a Babylonian king like Nebuchadnezzar, to take the royal seed line and the aristocrats out of the cities they conquered and to bring them and train them into the thinking and language, religion and philosophy, politics and so on of their government and try to use them as assets within to serve in their government. So this is a new beginning for Daniel. That's the point. While he's now in Babylon after what was essentially a judgment on Jerusalem. Okay, and it's under Nebuchadnezzar. But then we get this series of stories that progress, all related to Nebuchadnezzar still, and the kind of personal journey as God revealed things through Daniel to King Nebuchadnezzar, and it climaxes in the story of this dream of the tree and how Nebuchadnezzar gets chastised or disciplined for 7 years, and then eventually seems to experience salvation. Okay? So you get that sort of plot line running through the city of Babylon and its king Nebuchadnezzar. And then there's one more story added to it, but now it's not Nebuchadnezzar, of course, but Belshazzar. But when Belshazzar is judged and the hand comes out and writes on the wall, and Daniel has to interpret what was written on the wall, part of why Belshazzar, many years after Nebuchadnezzar, gets judged that very night and dies is because of the account here. This story of Nebuchadnezzar's conversion, his salvation. Remember we said that this is chapter 4. Remember we said that chapter 4 was all written by Nebuchadnezzar himself as a kind of decree? Well, that meant that Belshazzar could have known about this. And indeed, when Daniel goes to interpret the handwriting, he references this chapter here, the events in chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar converts and he turns to the God of the Hebrews. Belshazzar is accountable for that information, and he has rejected what happened to this sort of political ancestor, Nebuchadnezzar. And then, of course, Babylon itself is judged that night, and the whole city of Babylon falls to the Medo-Persian king Cyrus. Okay, and then the city is taken over by somebody else. Okay, so Babylon, essentially, that's the end. Then, right? That's the end of Babylon. Okay, so there's a nice plot structure where you start with Babylon sacking Jerusalem, and you get the story of Nebuchadnezzar's conversion and its effects, and how it precipitates the judgment and the fall of the city of Babylon. So whereas Babylon begins as the conqueror of Jerusalem, the first half of the book ends with that city, Babylon, or the capital of the Babylonians, of their empire, with it collapsing and getting sacked by another empire. Okay, so that's the first half of the book. And then guess what happens? Daniel ends up with a new beginning, now a kind of second new beginning. He's now under the Persians, except we're not just going to be hearing about Daniel's life under the Persians. There will be 2 other stories, so there's 3 total, that all relate to Daniel's life under the Persians, but it's not just a sequence of events that happen under Darius. And then we get a bunch of stories about Darius and the city of Babylon under Darius. That's just not what happens. There's very little emphasis on the actual rulers of Persia and how they react. The only real serious focus you get is in this first story here, the story of Daniel in the lion's den. You get some information there about Darius, but even that isn't primarily about him, but about Daniel's experience. All right, so when we get then to the second half, we have this open question: how is this organized? What's bringing all of these visions and events together? Because it's not quite the nice plot structure we saw over here. And we'll get to some of the details of that, by the way, later, of how some of this ties together. But just to show you at least one clear aspect of how the two halves work. Okay? So this is sort of along the lines of the structure of the stories and the visions and so on, all right? So the first is this, that in Daniel chapter 1, the first half of the book, we have a story about the law of Moses. Remember, Daniel refuses to eat the food and drink the wine in the schooling of Babylon because it violates the law of Moses. And so he and his friends refuse to partake. And then look at over here, when you begin the second half of the book, when Daniel's in this new beginning under Persia, what happens? But the Persian king Darius forbids prayer to be uttered toward anyone except to the gods of the Persians through Darius. So they can't pray to Yahweh, which is a violation of the law of Moses, of course. So Daniel, just as he refused to follow the law of the Babylonians way back here in chapter 1 in this story, chapter 1, here in chapter 6, we get Daniel refusing to follow the laws of the Medes and the Persians. Okay? So that's two stories there that relate directly to the law of Moses. There's much more to it than that, but we'll just show you how those two sort of relate. We then get over here a pair of stories. We get Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a giant metallic statue. It's got 4 different metals: gold, silver, bronze, and iron. The different metals that represent that they're composite for that statue. And then the next story in chapter 3 of Daniel is a golden statue. So chapters 2, can't write there. Chapters 2 to 4, no, I'll get it. Chapters 2 to 3 are 2 statues that are the centerpiece of the 2 stories, right? The golden statue and then the metallic statue, the different metals, the composite metals, and then the next one, the golden statue. And then over here, notice, we have another kind of pair of stories. We have the vision of 4 beasts, followed by the vision of 2 beasts. And the beasts are sort of representing similar kingdoms. There's an overlap of the kingdoms, the Gentile kingdoms that are represented by those beasts. Okay? So you see how we have a pair also over there. And then here, chapters 4 to 5, notice we have another pair of stories, because here God disciplines the king Nebuchadnezzar and drives him out into the wilderness, and he's punished, he's chastised temporarily, but then he's allowed to be restored. And here in the next story is not just a temporary judgment, but a final judgment of the regent Belshazzar over the city of Babylon. So that's a pair of stories of God's dealings with those kings and his discipline and judging of those kings. And then over here, we get a pair of stories in which we have an interpretation of writings. In Daniel chapter 9, Daniel has been reading the book of Jeremiah. And so Gabriel interprets for Daniel what Jeremiah meant. And then in the final story, we get the high angel interpreting the book of, not Daniel, but the book of the truth. And what does this mean, the book of the truth, and how is he interpreting that book? That's the last story, is the interpretation of the book of the truth. So there you have then at least a way to look at sort of the 2 halves of the book, some of the plot structure and some of the arrangement of the visions. In other words, the architecture of the book isn't just a straight chronological plot line. It's got, in the first half of the book, there's more of a strict chronology and a plot structure directly related to the chronology of Nebuchadnezzar's reign and Daniel's interactions with him and how that brought him to conversion and at the same time led to the judgment of Belshazzar. But in the second half of the book, you get more a structure of visions and the interpretations of writings. Now, the question you have for the next time is 2 questions. In the first half of the book, we'll just do it like this. In the first half of the book, we have a series of stories that relate to metals. In every one of these books, every one of these stories up here, you'll see that there's some reference to metals. metals are serving as a major sort of theme, a thread line running through the stories, something David Gooding pointed out. And the question is, what's the use of these metals and why are they important? Okay, what's their function in the various stories and why might they be important to Daniel? And why does God use these metals? Because it's God sometimes choosing to even depict things as metals. Why are those so important in sort of that part of Daniel, in the plot structure of the life of Nebuchadnezzar? Okay, so that's one question. And then in the second half of the book, you have a series of emphasis on writings. Different kinds of writings become a major focus of the book. It's not that there's no writings in the first part of the book, but the interpretations of writings and the nature of law and truth becomes a major part of the second half of the book. So what do the writings of law and truth, how do they function in all of these stories over here in the second half of the book, and why are they so important? Why might they be important in the visions that Daniel sees of the future? So there you have a pretty big challenge. I think it would take you a while to try and answer these questions. You have to read the book probably a number of times to try and figure out and to try and sort of chart out all the uses of metal and all the writings of law and truth. So best wishes, and we'll see you when you come back to the next video.